1958, construction began on the Dan Ryan Expressway, which successfully uprooted a portion of Englewood, Washington Park, Roseland, Morgan Park, and Fuller Park. This mainly affected the impoverished African American community in these neighborhoods, all by design. Many impoverished African Americans had to move in a pinch, and areas like Englewood and Northern Hyde Park was all that was available and affordable. These mostly white areas became further enraged, and the racial differences went full scale. This is when Laverne gathered many African American youths in the Englewood and Northern Hyde Park areas, mostly consisting of boys between the ages of 11 to 13 years old, alongside the Englewood Boys and 75th Street Brims, who were older boys. I am not positive, but it is possible Laverne and another named Richard Champstrong were possible members of the Englewood Boys or the Brims. It became decided to come together as one major force to battle these racial issues, but to also deal with the aggressive Egyptian Cobras that were now growing in the Englewood and Hyde Park areas. The Cobras were another African American gang that started in 1958 and were aggressively growing on the South Side. The boys decided to flip through the Holy Bible to get ideas, and that's when it dawned on them to use the name Disciple in their title. The boys then added on the prefix Devils to give the name an intimidating edge to it. After that was decided, the Disciples were simultaneously at 43rd Street in Kenwood and scattered throughout Englewood. A disciples group known as the East Side Disciples was the group that started at 43rd and spread all the way south into Hyde Park to 53rd and Kimbark. 53rd and Kimbark became East Side Disciple headquarters and basically the headquarters for all citywide disciples. However, Englewood disciples tended to gather at 63rd and Stewart. The disciples created the symbols of the Star of David, pitchfork, and devil's tail with devil horns when they formed in 1958. The first arch enemy of the disciple was the Sons of Italy, which was a white gang of greasers in Englewood and one of the more powerful South Side greaser gangs. The Sons of Italy objected to the neighborhood changing from white to black and would take out frustrations on black youths. Disciples also fought with other black gangs in Englewood like the Egyptian Cobras that moved to the neighborhood from Fuller Park in 1958. In the year 1958, Disciples made their first expansion move as they settled in the western part of the Woodlawn community, west of Woodlawn Avenue, as they took over about 2/3 of the Woodlawn neighborhood. The other 1/3 was Egyptian Cobra territory, who became arch-rivals along with the original group of Blackstone Rangers. The Disciples would make this neighborhood theirs permanently as they have maintained a heavy presence over the decades. By 1961, the Devil's Disciples were the most powerful gang in Englewood, and the Italian greaser gangs were fighting that losing war against the Disciples. By this time, the Italian greaser gangs had left Englewood. In the year 1961, 14-year-old David Barksdale took over leadership of the Devil's Disciples, and he directly oversaw the Englewood branch of the Disciples. Barksdale appointed Mingo as president of the Disciples in Hyde Park and Kenwood that became known as East Side Disciples. In the same year that David Barksdale took over the Disciples, Richard Strong and his family moved into the Cabrini Green public housing projects that was mostly ran by various small gangs and Egyptian Cobras. Strong developed quite a following in no time and recruited several black youths into his gang, the Black Deuces, which was the gang he created in Cabrini, but they were tied to the Devil's Disciples. This is how Disciples became a large presence in the Cabrini Green area until the projects were torn down. The Devil's Disciples were the largest gang on the South Side by 1965 and before. Even after the Blackstone Rangers started, Rangers were not as large. The Rangers only appeared larger because they were more outspoken to media outlets. On the date of January 6, 1966, the Disciples began recruiting gangs more instead of just focusing on recruiting just individuals. He wanted these gangs to all call themselves Disciple while still maintaining their original name. An example was when the Gonzados became Gonzado Disciples when they agreed to be part of the Disciples as an alliance. The coalition expanded Disciple boundaries beyond the Bronzeville area. This put Disciples in the Ida B. Wells, Clarence Darrow projects, Wentworth Gardens, Stateway Gardens projects, and heavily on the streets of Grand Boulevard and the Douglas communities. Older gangs from these communities flipped to Disciples or attached their gangs to the Disciple name. In the near south side, the disciples moved into the Harold Ikes projects. In 1966, the disciples became heavily active in the community, opening fundraisers, legitimate businesses, and forcing school policies to keep kids in school. Maybe some of that money went to illegal activities, but a great deal of it went into helping the community. David Barksdale used his power for some good, as can be seen. The disciples were also tied to civil rights groups and fought against civil rights injustices. In that summer of 1966, disciples even tried a peace treaty with the Rangers. This didn't last, but at least there was a large attempt. In the year 1967, the Woodlawn organization was awarded over $927,000 to be handed out to the Blackstone Rangers and the Black Disciples to operate job training centers for neighborhood youths in Woodlawn. All disciples and Rangers involved were paid a salary to be instructors of this program despite the lack of training. Disciples received about $360,000 of this money for the program. In these programs, there were both disciple and Ranger instructors and students in these classrooms. Sometimes gang fights happened in the classes. Black P-Stones and disciples squashed their war in May of 1968, and it lasted for days until May 8th. David Barksdale was out around 65th and Ellis in the Woodlawn area when detectives showed up to talk to him. Barksdale told the cops that the Ellis Rebel Stones, the only Stone group in West Woodlawn, was out to kill him. He did a test and led the cops to the end of an alley, and sure enough, the Stones opened fire and shot at David. The Stones were then arrested, but this also ended the peace treaty. In the year 1968, war began between the disciples and Supreme Gangster allied gangs, especially with the Supreme Gangsters. Larry Hoover became the target for assassination attempts. He was shot on 2 occasions. Then, on September 4, 1968, a third attempt was made on him. On this day, Englewood was on high alert as disciples, gangsters, and Stones were packing guns and ready to shoot each other. At Parker High School, members of the Supreme Gangsters and disciples were especially ready to get into drama against each other. Barron disciple member James Highsmith and disciple co-founder Leonard Longstreet entered Parker High School even though they weren't students. The two spotted Larry Hoover standing outside of the principal's office, and Highsmith walked past him with a smile as Longstreet shouted out, "Burn him!" Highsmith pulled out a .32 pistol and shot Larry Hoover and 2 others nearby. No one was killed, but Highsmith was convicted of the shooting and sentenced to 1 to 5 years. During this same year of 1968, Jeff Fort and the Black P-Stones were raking in thousands of dollars in government grant money, after projecting the public appearance as a community youth group in need of funding to help poverty. The money went to a lot of good and helped open legitimate businesses that helped young blacks. But on the other side of it, some of the money was used for illegal activities, and this caught the attention of the FBI that began investigations. The same groups that granted money to the Stones also gave money to the disciples as well. The disciples did not stick their necks out as much for the money and received the money as a default, because the gang apologists and liberal groups wanted to give money to the rivals of the Stones too. When Stones were questioned about who their worst rival is, they pointed to the disciples, and that prompted these groups to line the pockets of the disciples as well, many of times without disciples even asking for the money. Disciples used a lot of this money for good, just like the Stones, as they opened legit businesses and created programs to help black youths on the South Side, just like how the Vice Lords and Stones were doing. Just like Vice Lords and Stones, the disciples fell under FBI investigation for mismanaging those funds for illegal activities such as buying drugs and guns. The disciples' involvement with mismanaging these funds was not much in the newspaper because of their lower profile activities, and the disciples didn't trust the white man and the social case workers. They practically had no choice by 1968 to deal with them after the money was practically forced on them. By the year 1968, the Robert Taylor Homes public housing projects were ran by gangs like the Cobras Stones. 14-year-old black disciple vanguard Michael Mickey Bull Johnson moved into the Robert Taylor Homes in 1966 and became one of the first disciples in these projects at the age of 12. Johnson led a conquest to take over a large piece of the buildings between 49th and State down to 53rd and State in the Grand Boulevard and Washington Park neighborhoods in 1968. His conquest against the Cobra Stones was a success, and Mickey Bull put the disciples in the Robert Taylor homes for the first time in history. He then became the leader of all BD operations in those buildings. In the year 1968, Eugene Hairston, who was the founder and the second in command of the Black Stones, ordered 6 14-year-old Stones to kill David Barksdale for $1 apiece. As Barksdale was exiting a bar one night, the 6 Rangers shot Barksdale 6 times. However, Barksdale survived the attack and continued to run the disciples. Hairston was charged with solicitation of murder and sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. After massive amounts of war between the BDs and the Gangster Nation, Barksdale felt that the warring between the BDs and the gangsters was not a positive thing. Therefore, he offered a peaceful merger with 18-year-old Larry Hoover in January of 1969. Hoover accepted the offer in that month, and the Black Gangsters Disciples Nation was born. In June of 1969, Larry Hoover had enough of the Stones and conferenced with David Barksdale instead. Larry Hoover's alliance with Jeff Fort as allies for a few months had gone sour, and now Hoover met with David Barksdale. The two groups established an alliance that had a title known as the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. The Black Gangster Disciple Nation consisted of the Gangster Nation, which was the supreme gangsters and their gangster allies. These gangsters were to be led by Larry Hoover. The disciples were now known as Black Disciples, and this was the alliance of all the disciple gangs led by David Barksdale. Prince Old Timer was appointed the Prince of the Disciples, while Tennessee the Prince of the Gangsters. Again, this was still just an alliance, but it was a combined concept alliance, unlike the one between the Stones and the Gangsters. All disciple gangs and gangster gangs were all Black Gangster Disciples. Many disciples and gangsters just considered themselves BGDs or Black Gangster Disciples when this alliance was first established, and didn't even refer to themselves as Black Disciples or Gangsters. They fell in love with the BGD title. In the year 1971, the disciples began to fall into disorganization, and groups of disciples began not honoring the BGDN and even feuded with other disciple groups. There were those that wanted to overthrow Larry Hoover, and there were others that were disciples that didn't like the gangsters because of the old war with the gangsters. There were also some groups that had self-interest in mind, rebelling against leadership. By November 5, 1973, Hoover was sentenced to 150 to 200 years in prison in Statesville Correctional Facility in Crest Hill, Illinois. As Larry Hoover was now sitting in prison, David Barksdale's health was declining due to complications from previously being shot by the Black Stone kids a few years before. David Barksdale's kidneys were slowly shutting down. David Barksdale succumbed to his illness and died on September 2, 1974. The fond memory would live on of King David as a positive leader that truly worked to better lives for disciples and many people in his communities. In the Robert Taylor homes, Mickey Bull was advancing in rank as a top vanguard and was still running the buildings between 49th Street and 51st Street, especially the 5 white buildings at 51st and State and the red buildings on 49th. He was put in prison in 1973 for manslaughter charges, then was released in 1975. Now by the summer of 1976, he had enough power to order deeds he needed to be done. In July 1976, Todd White had stopped in the Robert Taylors by the 4844 South State Street building. White was not known around there and was wearing fancy clothes and drove a nice car. Mickey Bull and Thaddeus Terrell saw the man and saw an opportunity to rob White. Mickey Bull approached White while Terrell walked up and put a pistol to White's temple and told him to give them all his money. White said he had no money, and Bull searched him and found nothing. Bull then grabbed the man by his necktie and dragged him across the street. White gave a wisecrack saying, "I told you I didn't have any money." Then he twisted away and started to run. Bull was enraged because the man not only got physical and started running, but also because of his wisecrack. But Bull did not have to shoot White. Instead, he told Terrell to do it. Terrell then fired one shot right through White's chest. Mickey then said, "Pop him again, make sure he's dead." After the incident, both Terrell and Johnson were charged with murder. Even though Bull was still on parole for the 1973 manslaughter, he was only given 5 years for the murder and was back out in Robert Taylor by 1977. Mickey Bull was incarcerated again in the late 1970s. Before Bull went into prison, he managed to convince several members of the Mickey Cobras from a 49th and State Street Robert Taylor building to become black disciples. These Mickey Cobras were known as the Fidel Castro Mickey Cobras. The building that was taken was the 4844 building. In the year 1981, Mickey Bull was released from prison and was given a new rank as bishop, which was a very high position. Jerome Freeman was also released that same year. Mickey Johnson was like a prophet that informed all disciples that they were just black disciples, and it was no longer the name of the alliance, and all the gangs that had been under it were only to be known as black disciples. All those that were gangsters or were disciples that represented the BGD banner for over a decade would become part of the Black Gangster Disciple Gang. This is how the gangsters ended up being the larger force on the streets because of all the many disciple groups that loved the BGD banner. These new ways and the removal of the BGDN alliance brought great peace between BDs and BGDs in 1981 for years, as the folk alliance still bound them together. Mickey also taught BDs the new hand sign, which was the gates or the 3 fingers. This was the new hand sign. Mickey Johnson made sure not all of the Stateway Gardens became BGD, and even convinced most of the Del Vikings to flip to BDs, making the BDs have a strong presence in the Stateway Gardens. This is the story of how BDs got into the Stateway Gardens in 1981. In the year 1982, Mickey Bull and the BDs took over the long-standing Mickey Cobra buildings near 45th and State. This was the 4555 and 4525 buildings, which the Cobras held since 1962. This left the Mickey Cobras with only the whole, which was 3 buildings from 53rd and State down to 54th and State. Mickey Bull had successfully pushed the MC south of 53rd Street. In the year 1984, Mickey Bull was promoted again to the rank of minister, which gave him his own dynasty. Being a minister was a very high rank that usually no one receives in the organization. Having a dynasty means you control an entire area of the city. Mickey's dynasty was the entire south side of Chicago. Anywhere from Bronzeville down to the Wild 100s was controlled by Mickey. His main territory that he directly supervised daily was the Robert Taylor homes. He held BD meetings in front of the 4950 building. Bull himself stayed at 5041 South Federal Street in apartment 1505 with Brenda Ware. He ran that building and all the buildings around, according to Chicago Tribune, on December 3, 1986. In the early 1980s and mid-1980s, relations between BDs and BGDs was at its best point, especially now that Folk Nation rules and regulations reached the streets. Now both gangs would often team up against rivals like Vice Lords, Black P-Stones, and Mickey Cobras. The crack cocaine epidemic of the late 1980s caused relations between the two gangs to completely break down, mainly because of the crack trade in the Inglewood neighborhood. Beginning in the year 1987, fierce competition and intense gang wars erupted in the high-rise public housing projects citywide. Gangs began muscling in on these buildings and began setting up their own security as they walked through the hallways armed with automatic weapons and shotguns as they patted down residents and imposed curfews. The competition was fierce. They even controlled the elevators in the projects and would jump down the shafts and hitch rides up and down. In the hot summer of 1991, some GDs were ready for war with the BDs, but Mickey Bull was holding relations tight between the two organizations, and this was a threat to GDs that did not want to be controlled this way. Bull was not expecting GDs to come after him because there was no full-fledged war yet. He was also untouchable, and many BDs and GDs feared and respected him. Mickey was mild-mannered and charming, but he would also have no tolerance for those that crossed him. When he walked the streets, he had a special whistle that BDs knew. When Mickey whistled, it meant he was summoning some soldiers for business. It didn't matter what you were doing, if you were lying in bed with the flu, if you were lying in bed with your girl, if you were taking a shit, it didn't matter. You had to stop everything and rush outside to Mickey when he whistled. He had this kind of power and enemies could not touch him because he could see it coming. But in August of 1991, he never expected GDs to come at him, and that is what happened. Members of the Gangster Disciples shot him dead on the streets, which caused an immediate violent backlash from the BDs that became legendary. Payback had to be harsh for this, and on August the 7th, Inglewood was a war zone. By August of 1991, during one of the hottest and driest summers in Chicago history, the feuding between GDs and BDs was taken to a new level because of the death of Mickey Bull. On August 7, 1991, the Black Disciples murdered 3 members of the Gangsters Disciples in cold blood on that hot August Wednesday night. The murders were done out of a taxicab. Yes, a taxicab. The BDs actually shot them from a taxicab, which is one of the craziest ways a gang could do a hit on someone. The problems all started that day at 66th and Peoria at the apartments at 6556 South Peoria Street, when Tojo, a Black Disciple, came pulling up in the afternoon and taunted 3 Gangster Disciples members by throwing up the BD gang sign. One of the GDs, Kevin Gibbs, threw up a sign and shouted BDK, and Tojo said GDK. Then someone inside the building shot at Tojo and he started to drive off, but stopped real quick to say he would be back later. Later that night at 11 p.m. the Gangsters Disciples were back out there selling drugs on that corner when a red and white taxicab drove up with a red LeBaron. Both vehicles then stopped and one of the windows on the taxicab rolled down and a barrel of a gun appeared as the shooting suddenly started. All 3 Gangster Disciples were shot, but 2 of them survived while the other died. A little while later at 618 West 71st Street, out in front of a Submarine sandwich shop, another shooting happened in which 3 Gangsters Disciples were shot again. 2 of them ended up dying at that corner. The taxicab was apparently stolen to be used in this shooting, perhaps as a diversion. After all, who would expect a taxi to pull up and start shooting? Between 1991 and 1994, the south side of Chicago was in a state of intense warfare between GDs and BDs. Gang members from both gangs basically said you couldn't go anywhere during that time. It was not until 1994, when Marvel Thompson stepped in, after he was cleared on a murder charge, that the violence between GDs and BDs settled down for a short time. But in 1994 the war became permanent between GDs and BDs, as Black Gangster Disciples were now officially known as Gangster Disciples. There's a popular story of a young BD named Yummy who was murdered by his fellow BDs. In other words, he was backdoored. Yummy was a young 11-year-old fresh new recruit to the BDs in 1994. Yummy was a kid that used to steal cars and break into houses since he was 8 years old. Law enforcement could not put him in juvenile detention because he was too young, and he could not go to any more foster homes because he was too violent. In August 1994, the Black Disciples had him kill some rival GDs. Yummy blasted a 9mm pistol into a crowd of kids and accidentally killed young 14-year-old Siobhan Dean. The murder brought a lot of public outcry and attention to the Black Disciples. The BDs feared that this young of a member would snitch if he were caught by the police. Yummy's 14 and 16-year-old fellow BDs lured him to a viaduct underpass, had him get on his knees, then pumped 2 bullets in the back of his head. The 2 BDs were then convicted of the murder, and a lot of attention ended up on the Black Disciples over this issue for a few years to come, despite the BD leaders' attempt to cover this up. The BDs grew incredibly in the 1990s and 2000s decade as they climbed up to becoming one of the top 10 largest gangs in Chicagoland, with members in other states and scattered all over the suburbs. Violent gang wars erupted in the Robert Taylor and Stateway Gardens projects as gunfire echoed day and night, mainly between BDs and GDs. Both gangs exercised majority control of both public housing high-rise complexes, and other gangs had a very small piece of these buildings. Therefore, the BDs and GDs were each other's biggest competition in these projects. The BDs showed their muscle against the larger enemy and showed relentless pursuit of violence against their foes, which gained them a massive reputation, causing many starry-eyed young black youths to want to join the gang as they grew to over 6,000 members. In 1991, the Black Disciples took over the 16-story high-rise Randolph Tower Housing Authority complex located in the Washington Park neighborhood, which was located at 6217 South Calumet Avenue. This large building the BDs nicknamed the Castle, where they set up a complex $45,000 a day to as much as $300,000 a day crack cocaine and heroin operation in this tower. The tower was run by Marvel Thompson and residents, and anyone was searched at the front door by armed BD guards with automatic weapons and shotguns. This operation was incredibly complex, as money from drug profits was even laundered and invested into an Atlanta nightclub, apartment buildings, and even into the rap label MOB. Black Disciple snipers were posted on the roof of the buildings, equipped with high-powered and complex sniper rifles, while they wore night vision goggles at night so they could spot enemy gang members and pick them off. The building was not friendly to police officers, and Chicago police stayed away, especially after one incident where an undercover officer entered the building, and as he was patted down, a bulletproof vest was discovered. As he tried to run, a BD pulled out his pistol and shot the officer in the back, but the officer survived. The BDs even became so bold that they hijacked the WCFL 104.7 radio frequency that was a frequency owned by a Christian radio station in the suburb of Morris. Once you arrived in Chicago city limits, the frequency was playing gangster rap music that was described by the Chicago Tribune article I got all this info from as having lots of foul language. The frequency owners were shocked when they drove to Midway Airport and the music suddenly took over. The frequency was also said to be used to communicate with the tower to alert the gang of any possible threats coming. In 2004, a massive raid by the police swept through this complex as several members were arrested. In the aftermath, it was decided the best way to stop the dealings at this complex was to tear the complex down, and in 2004 the buildings were razed. The tower was the largest drug operation the Black Disciples had ever ran, but the gang would continue to grow and open new ventures regardless. The Black Disciples have grown to over 6,000 members. In 2005, Jerome "Shorty" Freeman was released from prison after being put away for 16 years. In 2011, Shorty died of health issues at the age of 60. This organization was originally started in the early 1960s by a man named Jerome Freeman and David Barksdale, who was the leader of the Devils and Gonzato Disciples at the time. Barksdale was organizing and uniting several local street gangs within the area, forming the Black Disciple Nation and absorbing the Black King Cobras within the Disciple Nation. This was done through the development of a close relationship between himself and Freeman at the time. Also, history states that another gentleman by the name of Larry Hoover was starting the Gangster Nation after reigning as the leader of the Supreme Gangsters. After Hoover's group and Barksdale's group battled, after some time with neither side showing a sign of giving up, the two joined forces and formed the BGDN, battling against the opposing enemy, the BPSN and Vice Lords. In 1969, David Barksdale was gunned down and later died from his wounds in 1974. Leaving Hoover and Freeman as the top two successors of the BGDN throne. Hoover took over the BGDN after Barksdale's death and formed the Folk Nation in 1978. Jerome Freeman broke away from the organization with his followers and went back to the organization's roots, reforming the Black Disciple Nation. The BDs, descendants of the BGDN, joined the Folk Nation, keeping some ties to the organization. Although throughout the 80s and 90s the BDs battled with the BGDs, and after battling for so long the BGDs went as far as dropping the B from the moniker, now just being known as GDs. And on the other hand, the BDs began showing the pitchforks of the GD Nation upside down, no longer using the symbol during the early mid-90s to the present. The BDs' ancestor group, the Black King Cobras, began to resurface on the streets of Chicago. The Black King Cobras remain to retain close ties to the BDN, honoring and representing BD symbols, colors, and literature. Black King Cobras also wear and represent the colors black and green, and their main symbol is a cobra snake. Some believe this small group consists of Mickey Cobras as well as Black Disciples gang members. I'm not sure how true this is, but it's a significant mention, being the Mickey Cobras and Black Disciples have several alliances scattered throughout the south side of Chicago. The Black King Cobras has a new leader of the organization, although the organization still recognizes Jerome Freeman as the founder, retaining close ties to the BDN organization. The Black King Cobras are much smaller than their ancestor group BDN, and some may say they are completely extinct, while others say they are mixed within the BD Nation unnoticed and looked at as BD. Regardless which is true, the Black King Cobras are definitely a part of the Black Disciples' history. The breed history on the streets begins in the year 1969 in the North Lawndale neighborhood at the intersection of 19th to 16th and Kidsey, right near Douglas Park. The original gang was called the Goon Squad or Goon Squad Gangsters. It is possible the founder was named Rab. This was a group of rather violent and crazy youths that were quick with the trigger. They had violent gang wars with the Vice Lords, especially traveling Vice Lords, and were recognized by police as far back as 1969, and even made the newspaper a few times dating back to 1969. The Goons made the newspaper 3 times beginning in 1969, again in 1970, and finally in 1972. All 3 times the Goons were involved in violent crimes. Boony was not part of this gang despite what many believe. He was a 31-year-old man and in prison at the time, and would not be the leader of teenagers shooting and stabbing rivals in the streets while making the newspaper. The Goons get lots of credit though, because they were starting during a time when North Lawndale was untouchable for new gangs to form, because the Vice Lords and Egyptian Cobras ruled that whole neighborhood with an iron fist. The Vice Lords alone ran it from Pulaski to Douglas Park, but the Goons dared to challenge them. The Goons were perhaps more violent than the Vice Lords, which would later get them noticed by the Black Gangsters once their leadership ended up in prison. Goons lived up to their name and would later work as murder for hire, just like the Black Gangsters and Boony. George Boony Black Davis's gang affiliations were not very known, as was shown in the court documents when he was convicted of armed robbery and attempted murder in 1981. The royal family and Boony Black were possibly higher up in the prison system than gang leaders like Larry Hoover and Jeff Fort. It is possible leadership of the major gangs paid taxes to Boony and the rest of the Black Gangsters syndicate. I am not positive on when the term Black Gangsters came to be, but it was for sure used by the time all these men became incarcerated in 1981. Both Boony and Cochise had strong connections with the Italian Mafia. They were incarcerated in Stateville and Menard Correctional Facility, which was a big incarceration place of Italian Mafia wise guys. The Black Gangsters were top tier because of this connection and were the alphas of the prison system. These guys never got caught for hundreds of possible homicides and, like the royal family, they did not like witnesses and often killed them. There was even situations where they would cut the heads off victims and put their heads in their laps to send a message. I will touch a lot more on the royal family in its own chapter, because there's a lot to tell and so many legends to speak on, like the Godfather many referred to as Jeepers. The BGs originated when a group under the leadership of George Boony Black Davis broke away from the Black Gangster Disciples along with Davis. Other founders of the gang included Samuel King Ram Lawrence and Maurice King Baldy Jackson. Other leaders would include Cochise, Gam, and Jeepers. After the splinter, the BGs immediately became entangled in a long-standing war with the BGDs. In fact, the only assassination attempt against Hoover since he has been incarcerated was perpetrated by BG leadership. Larry Hoover was stabbed several times, but was saved by Milwaukee King leader King Shaky. Larry then had Boony stabbed 27 times, but both men survived. This is also the coming together of the Royal Family Goon Squad gangsters and black gangsters to create the BGN, or Black Gangster Nation. Boony would retain his control of the prison system, as he always did, but now he was in charge of the black gangsters as an organization. The ABLA public housing projects were designated to the black gangsters, and this was the beginning of the Black Gangsters' New Breed's direct history. In the early 1980s, the BGs, known then during the political mob era as Better Guidance, developed a voter registration organization called the Concerned Youth Association. The CYA was intended to give the illusion that the gang had legitimate interests in politics and thus draw attention away from their criminal enterprise. However, it dissolved shortly after its inception with little fanfare. Throughout the 1980s, the BGs expanded their base of operations from the ABLA housing project complex on the city's near west side to the K-Town area of the city's west side. During this expansion, their principal adversaries were the Gangster Disciples, Vice Lords, and Black Souls. The Black Souls were brazen enough to put a hit on Davis the Don while he was serving a sentence in Stateville Correctional Center in 1987. The hit was actually orchestrated by a former high-ranking BG who had recently flipped Black Soul. This occurred in 1987. After the hit attempt, in which another BG lost his life, the BGs asked the BGDs to assist them, however, they did not. This apparently angered the BGs, who dropped out of the Folks Alliance altogether. They also dropped the six-pointed star from their insignia and adopted the 3 L's from it: love, life, and loyalty. 1981 was the time when folks and people were becoming official on the streets and in prison. What angered Boony the most when he arrived in 1981 was that his black gangsters were aligning with the folks and incorporating with the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. This is how folks ends up interwoven within the BGN, but this was not authorized or official with Boony and never was. In the 1980s, members of the streets very often claimed folks, but this was never official by the main leadership. Therefore, the breeds technically were never folks or peoples. There was a war within the BGN on the west side in the 1980s, and this was the early development of the new breeds, and this is perhaps how folk concepts were brought in for a time, as the group against the original BGN likely claimed folks on the streets, but once in prison there was no rebellion in the 80s. There were 3 main factions the BGs had in the city. One of them was ran by George Davis, who had the ABLA projects in the Robert Brooks Homes row houses, Grace Abbott Homes, and Loomis Courts. He also had the 16th Street BGs, who were in North Lawndale, which represented the original Goon Squad birthing place by 16th to 19th, and Kedzie, which would spread to 13th. The rivalry with traveling Vice Lords would continue in all territories ran by Boony. Roger Collins ran the Harold Ikes projects and the 29th Street project buildings in the Dearborn Homes projects at 29th and Federal area, possibly in the 2901 and 2931 buildings. This group was known as Black Goon Squad Gangsters, as they were described as in 1984 newspapers, as they went to war with El Rookins over drug turf. The third chapter was the Pocket Town chapter in the Greater Grand Crossing community at 71st to 75th, South Chicago Avenue to Kimbark. This deck was run by Samuel King Ram Lawrence. These were the original decks of the Black Gangsters established in 1981, and these men were some of the original L's of the Trayz L or Triple L aspect of the organization. There were also Black Goon Squad Gangsters in the Ida B. Wells projects and Phillips High School in the 1980s. They followed the BGN. After the Black Gangsters formed in 1981, they made a conquest to the suburb of Zion, Illinois, and in the south suburb of Harvey. However, their presence was not necessarily territorial, but instead for business reasons. The leadership of this new organization knew how to make money on the streets and aggressively pursued drug turf while violently wiping out competition. The old ways of the 1970s Royal Family and Goon Squad were installed in young members living in the village in the 1980s. Many of these young men were already from some of the roughest and rawest breed of killers and naturally fit in with the Black Gangsters. The way of this organization was to not let anything stop them, especially the traveling Vice Lords. In the year 1992, a younger group of black gangsters broke away and called themselves New Breeds or Triple L Breeds. This group was not connected with People or Folk Alliance. These young bloods were even more aggressive than the Boony Black-led black gangsters as they moved into new territory at 16th and Costner in the North Lawndale neighborhood where they cliqued up with Black Souls. The Breeds also opened up in West Garfield Park and clicked up with the Black Souls in that community as they battled several Vice Lord factions. The BGs are an extremely strict organization, and it is not uncommon for the gang to issue a death violation. In West Garfield Park, the Breeds even flipped Gangster Disciples out of their original West Side set. The Breeds stormed the Austin neighborhood in 1992 and the East Garfield Park neighborhood, claiming the area known as Fifth City. The Breeds even opened territory in the West Humboldt Park community as they battled with conservative Vice Lords and Latin Kings in 1992. The Breeds also spread deeper onto the South Side as they opened in the West Englewood neighborhood, Roseland, South Shore, and the suburbs of Rockford, Maywood, and Bellwood. Breeds also opened a big section in the city of New Orleans in Louisiana as well as St. Louis, Missouri. In the year 1997, George Davis was let out of prison, and when he returned to the streets, the fear and respect young Breeds felt returned. Davis now offered to combine forces, making the Black Gangster New Breeds official. Breeds and Black Disciples became very close in relationship as they both were heavily at war with Gangster Disciples. Both Breeds and BDs established the Trayz Both Wayz alliance, as three fingers could symbolize both gangs, the LLL for Breeds and the Gates for BDs. The Breeds have grown to over 6,000 plus members over the years and are known to be very quick to use their guns. Many bodies have come up during gang wars between Breeds and their adversaries, and most of the time it is their enemy that ends up dead. It is known that the Breeds wiped out the traveling Vice Lords in the village. The Breeds became the largest gang in the ABLA projects as they viciously battled Vice Lord factions in those projects until the majority of them were torn down. When most of the village was torn down, the Vice Lords were out of the ABLA homes, but the Breeds outlived everyone else and remain in these renovated buildings. The Breeds were founded by black organized crime members that had heavy ties to the Italian Chicago outfit. Breeds were born out of men that were cold-blooded killers that would very easily take a life without blinking. Cochise first connected with the Italian outfit in 1971 and later became a co-founder of this organization. Boony Black was another co-founder that was a hardened gangster that had no fear and was known to be a serious gangster. It was even rumored that he shut down the Italian outfit at one point in time. Boony's connection to the outfit even outdates any part of Breed history and Cochise's connections to the outfit. Boony dressed well and like an old-time gangster. Boony led an extortion operation and most of his customers scrambled to pay him as quickly as possible. Boony was tall with big wide eyes and had a handlebar mustache, making him look ferocious. Not only that, his record of violent crime proved he could be dangerous if crossed. I don't know if Boony was born in Chicago or if he moved alongside African American migration from the southern states like other big-time gang leaders like Larry Hoover or Jeff Fort. The only birthing info I have is that he was born on May 23, 1938, making him much older than Larry Hoover, Jeff Fort, and even older than Pepilo Perry, the founder of the Vice Lords. Boony outages all the other gang leaders, and I have only heard about notorious older gang leaders from groups like the Latin Kings, but among African American gangs, Boony is the oldest among them. By the time the late 1950s came around, which was the birthing time of the Gangster Disciples, Black Disciples, Vice Lords, Mickey Cobras, and Black P. Stones, Boony was already in his 20s in age and was older and more connected to organized crime than the younger gang leaders that were just starting out in the late 50s. It is said that Boony was over Larry Hoover and perhaps was even a shot caller on the streets and in prison. However, Boony certainly would let Larry Hoover take the spotlight. Any organized gangster would do the same. The less attention, the better for business. In the September 15, 2009, issue of Az's magazine, author Mark Brown stated in the article that Boony was gangbanging for 40 years. The Breed's history as an organization would have begun 40 years ago from 2009, but I highly doubt that is Boony's personal story. Before and up to the 2000s decade, Boony was connected in a way to the Chicago outfit and did murder for hire and had various other connections with the Italian mob, with extortion and even drug trafficking. This further makes me believe a little more in the rumor that he had Italian blood in him, or at least relatives with Italian blood, which would have brought him closer to the mob. I have never learned about any African-American Chicago gangster as connected to the mob as Boony Black. Other leaders like Wayne Jack Bobo Edwards of the Black Souls and some of the Black P. Stone's leaders had connections, but those seemed like only business connections. But with Boony it seems a little more of a personal connection, but then again there is much about him that I do not know. Davis was what is known as a goon, which tends to refer to someone that will inflict pain or kill for money. Davis was large-sized, so he was ideal for the job of cracking skulls for money. According to Az's magazine on their September 15, 2009 issue, in an exclusive interview with Boony Black himself, he described himself as highly successful at collecting debts, and not even one of them told him no. He described that he had a look about him that made people give up the location of their stash. He didn't know why they looked at him and gave it up, but many times that's all it took. When looking at pictures of him, you can see it in his eyes as a man that doesn't play around and will get what he needs at all costs. In the magazine, he described a method of torturing drug dealers by taking 2 butcher knives and putting them over a high flame on the stove until they were red hot. He would then give them a chance to talk, and if there was any hesitation, he would put the scalding knives on their neck. Boony was also a barn boss in Cook County Jail. Barn bosses were dominant over other inmates and were often the more violent alpha inmates that kept other inmates in line, using deadly force if necessary. Barn bosses many times even have more control over the jails than prison staff, resulting in corrections officers having to work with barn bosses for mutual control of the jail. Barn bosses had many henchmen under their control and had access to many homemade weapons. The barn boss system was set up in 1968 to control the inmates in exchange for power bestowed upon by the correctional staff. Boony was one that was chosen, which is prior to when gang leaders of big gangs started coming to prison. The only main gang leader locked up by then was Eugene Hairston of the Black P. Stones, so Boony was a barn boss before the big players arrived. A strong connection to the Chicago outfit, combined with being elected a barn boss, made Boony of utmost power in the prison system. Barn bosses could kill, mutilate, tax, move about the sections of prison, and had the keys to all parts of the prison. The only key they lacked was a key outside of prison. This was deemed necessary by the prison staff because the prisons were out of control with violent inmates. Boony was an alpha above those killers and psychopaths and would bring these killers to their knees. As you can see, the power of Boony and his henchmen, the Black Gangsters, was growing before the 70s even got here and before the Goon Squads and Royal Family even started. George Boony Black Davis was considered the last Don and the last of a dying breed. He was heavily honored, and when he died in 2009 at the age of 71, almost every member of the new breed showed up to pay respect. This story begins in the year 1972 in Statesville Maximum Security Prison in Crest Hill, Illinois. An inmate by the name of Julius Davis joined in with a semi-religious group called the Cosmos, which happened to be a group of Chicago gang members from the west side of Chicago. I do not know what gang Julius Davis was a member of, but he organized the men to create their own crime syndicate that would become the Royal Family. Members of this group were in street gangs like Black Gangster Disciples and Vice Lords, and they were some of the most hardcore gang members of these gangs. They set aside their rivalry to be a part of the Royal Family. One of the prominent members was Maurice King Baldy Jackson. The men that joined the royal family were scheduled to be released from prison in 1972, and they planned a coming together once released and going on a crime spree. It is interesting to me how all these men just so happened to be released at the same time. This leads me to believe the royal family consulted with Jeepers for their legal advice, and perhaps Jeepers helped them to fight their legal battles and get released. Thomas Jeepers Jefferson, who was born in 1922 in Mississippi. Jefferson and his family moved to the west side of Chicago when Jeepers was just a boy back in the 1920s. By the time the Great Depression began, Jeepers' family was impoverished and could not afford much. According to the September 15, 2014, Chicago Sun-Times article about him, he stole a pair of pants from an open-air market as a boy because his parents could not afford clothes for him. A few years later, he stole another pair of pants and soon became hooked on stealing fancy clothes. He was caught on his second theft and was defended by the infamous lawyer Clarence Darrow, and Jefferson was impressed by the lawyer's way of using the legal system to get a desired outcome. Jefferson graduated to armed robbery and ended up in prison in 1941, according to a September 16, 1976, Jet magazine article. After this, he went on many robbery capers and stole lots of money, doing 5 prison terms in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Jefferson boasted he never hurt anyone during his capers. Jeepers became a genius when it came to studying the law and became more knowledgeable than many high-priced, trained lawyers. During his many stints in prison, he helped several inmates get released, get fair trials, and be treated correctly when facing the judicial system. In exchange, inmates would help him out in different ways. Jeepers worked with members of just about every major gang in Chicago, as Jeepers was not a gangbanger. However, he was especially embraced by Boony Black as a close friend and was a member of the Black Gangsters' New Breeds. Additionally, Jeepers was well known to be a colorful storyteller who loved to share his criminal exploits of being the stick-up man. I theorize it is very possible he told these stick-up stories to the royal family and inspired them to begin this armed robbery spree they were about to embark upon when released. Doing stick-ups became the early pastime of the royal family, and they may have been helped along with advice from Jeepers himself while they were all locked up together. Jeepers was in prison in the early 70s, so it is very possible. One thing to clarify though, the violence that was committed along the way of the royal family's robberies would have not been part of Jeepers' advice. Jeepers was never a violent man in any way, shape, or form. Jeepers was said to be a good man and kind-hearted. In April of 1972, the royal family members were released from prison, including the 24-year-old leader Julius Davis. Davis made the first move for the royal family as he targeted the Tally Ho restaurant at 1513 Chicago Avenue in the suburb of Evanston. Davis had worked there for only 1 week in June of 1972 until he was fired. Now, the following week on June 16, 1972, Davis, Teddy Candler, and one other burst into the restaurant as it closed, wildly wielding kitchen knives, demanding money from patrons and the restaurant owner. The 3 men tied up 2 patrons while they escorted the owner, assistant manager, and the assistant manager's relative into the office to open the safe. When there was some refusal to open the safe, the men reacted violently and stabbed the owner in the chest and 3 times in the back. Then they stabbed the assistant manager twice in the back, killing them both. Candler and Davis did not wear masks or gloves and made off with $300. Police very easily tracked down Candler and arrested him. Police went searching for Julius Davis because they had a positive identification from witnesses. This angered the rest of the royal family because Davis was reckless and did not use a mask or gloves, and the robbery was very sloppy. The royal family then made the decision to eliminate their leader and managed to hunt him down before police could find him. On June 18, 1972, police found the burned body of Julius Davis, as he had also been shot 7 times and left at 3748 South Wabash in the Grand Boulevard neighborhood of Chicago. Davis also suffered burns indicating he was tortured. The investigating officer was the notorious John Burge, who was later indicted on charges in 1993 of torturing and murdering suspects while forcing confessions. Given that it was Burge at the scene, who knows what all could have transpired with this murder. Allegedly, at the time, police did not know that Davis was killed by his own gang, but later they would find out all about the royal family and the motive for the murder. The rampage of the royal family had just begun. As I stated earlier, Jeepers committed so many armed robberies without hurting anyone, and I would not be surprised if his beliefs in nonviolent robbery were adopted by the royal family, perhaps at Jeepers' wishes, but Julius Davis and Teddy Candler did not follow those beliefs, and that very likely was one of the reasons the men were removed. The biggest reason would have been no mask or gloves and being sloppy. Now that Davis was eliminated, Roger Cochise Collins took over as the new leader of the royal family. Cochise would gain much more respect and was considered the godfather of the organization and presided over the Council of War. Collins wanted his organization to function more like a syndicate with the distribution of drugs, murder for hire, robbery, and intimidation and elimination of witnesses. Collins connected with the Chicago outfit back in 1971 when he was in prison with Robert Fat Man Cruz and royal family member Murray Hooper. Cruz was an excellent connection because he was the cousin of Harry Aleman, who was the Chicago outfit's chief hitman. And Cruz was also the nephew of Joseph Joe Nagal Ferriola, the chief enforcer of the Chicago outfit. This connection would bring the royal family murder for hire contracts to kill for the Chicago outfit, and later would connect the royal family to the outfit for narcotics trafficking. Jeepers also claimed that while he was in prison in the 1930s, Al Capone himself nicknamed him Jeepers because of how Jeepers looked. However, it was said another wise guy was the actual one to give him that nickname, and Jeepers perhaps did not want to reveal the real name or just wanted to add color to his story. The royal family had no tolerance for witnesses and dealt with them in a brutal way. The first example of this was in May of 1972, right before the Tally Ho heist. On May 17, 1972, 3 royal family members held up a tavern in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood at 505 West 79th Street. The next day, the royal family felt that the bartender Joseph Murphy might be able to identify them, so 5 members of the gang went into the tavern on May 19th and lit up Murphy in a hail of gunfire as the bartender was brutally shot 10 times. Anthony Holmes, one of the members, was charged with the murder. On June 14, 1972, right before the Tally Ho hold-up, Roger Collins and Richard Black robbed 2 customers and 3 employees at the Morseview drugstore at 1448 West Morse Avenue in the Rogers Park neighborhood. The men made off with $939, but police soon chased them down to Lake Shore Drive, where they crashed their car during a high-speed chase. Black and Collins were now in court for this case for months. Then on September 13, 1972, a man visited witness Sidney Frankfurt and said he was Collins and Black's lawyer, and tried to convince Frankfurt not to testify and showed pictures of Frankfurt and other employees. The incident was chilling, but Frankfurt still wanted to testify. On October 29, 1972, men burst into the drugstore and kidnapped Frankfurt and his cashier Mrs. N. Barton. The 2 were stuffed into a truck and driven to 57th and LaSalle in the Washington Park neighborhood. Then the 2 were shot and killed. Then the car was set on fire. The royal family did not appreciate witnesses to their drug trafficking activities either. The royal family had even established connections within the Chicago Police Department by 1972. Maurice King Baldy Jackson had come across information that Harold Bush was informing police of the royal family's drug trafficking operations. Jackson and police officer Chester Thomas kidnapped Harold Bush from the intersection of 14th and Western Avenue. Then they drove him to 130th and Indiana onto a secluded dirt road in the Riverdale neighborhood. The men shot Bush in the neck and left him, but Bush survived and implicated the 2. Both Jackson and Thomas were arrested for attempted murder. Officer Thomas was also being implicated in an August 19, 1972 triple murder, where a witness saw Thomas's license plates pull away from the scene of the crime at 1646 South Pulaski in the North Lawndale neighborhood. Maurice Jackson was implicated in another royal family murder in October of 1973 after police arrested royal family members Marvin Duncan and Fred Weaver. They found the wallet and identification of Darnell Carr, who had just been bound, gagged, and brutally beaten to death at 9147 South Ashland Avenue in the Burnside neighborhood. Weaver told police Maurice Jackson ordered this murder. The gang would continue their rampage. On July 5, 1973, Walter Wilbon, Leroy Williams, and Jeffrey Bowen robbed Judy's Lounge at 2852 East 87th Street in the South Chicago neighborhood. When Officer Randall came to the scene, the men shot him and they fled. The officers survived, and all 3 royal family members were convicted. In 1974, royal family gang member John Miles went on a major armed robbery spree as he was arrested for 10 or more armed robberies, one that resulted in him shooting a store clerk in the back. The royal family was robbing and killing across the country and had major drug operations on the South Side, as they were implicated in as many as 30 murders across the country between 1972 and 1974. Anyone that was a state's witness would either be intimidated or killed. One such incident was an undertaker that was present during one of the royal family's armed robberies and wanted to cooperate as a witness. The witness was in fear for his life, and police offered protection by having police guards present at his funeral home. One night, the royal family dug up one of the bodies from the nearby grave and threw it through the window of the funeral parlor office to intimidate the witness after midnight that night. This was a show of power and intimidation. By the summer of 1974, police cracked down hard on the royal family and made 13 arrests of members of the gang. The police had implicated that Roger Cochise Collins was the leader of the gang, and the gang had drug operations in Chicago and Gary, Indiana. Members of the gang were brought up on trial for various crimes, but sentences that were handed down were extremely light, as members only got a few years apiece. However, police were able to boast that they dissolved the gang's operations, as they stated in the August 24, 1974, Tribune article. It could be possible that their connection with Jeepers may have helped them get the legal counsel they needed, thus leading to light sentences. In 1977 through 1979, many royal family members were being released from prison for their part in the 1972 to 1974 crime spree. Members of the gang went back to work by March of 1979. That started with the murder of Donald Curtis, the owner of the Blinking Cat Lounge located at 87th and Peoria in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood. They robbed the bar and gunned down the owner with semi-automatic weapons on March 31, 1979. On May 7, 1979, the gang stormed Metropolitan Insurance Company in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood located at 9046 South Ashland Avenue, where they robbed the place at gunpoint. As they fired several bullets near witnesses to scare them, they made off with $19,000. On August 7, 1979, also in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood, the gang hit Concord gas station located at 440 West 87th Street. Police arrested the men and found a stash of weapons that included a shotgun and a semi-automatic carbine. On August 27, 1979, Roger Cochise Collins was released from prison and immediately went to work putting the royal family back together as he reunited with paroled gang members. Once Cochise was out of prison, he was immediately given a murder-for-hire contract. The ex-husband of Catherine Tynes hired Collins, Maurice Powell, and the nephew of Collins to kill Catherine Tynes because they were having a property dispute. Maurice Powell was the ringleader of the robberies early in the year while Collins was still in prison. Now Collins was back in charge, and him and Powell now carried out this contract. Police were frustrated that the royal family was back at it again and were even more furious all these men received parole. By December of 1979, Roger Collins had set up a drug ring at 2240 South State Street, which is within the Harold Ikes projects located in the near South Side neighborhood. This brought about gang wars with the black gangster disciples that were trying to control the drug trade in these projects that became bloody by 1980. On the night of November 12, 1980, the drug disputes with rival dealers in the Ikes projects escalated when Murray Hoop Hooper, Maurice Pimp Powell, and Roger Cochise Collins kidnapped Frederick Lacey, R.C. Pettigrew, and Roger Holliman as they rounded the men up at an apartment at 2240 State Street. The 3 men were tied up and led to a vehicle, then driven to the intersection of Roosevelt and Clark in the South Loop area and brought under the viaduct. Frederick Lacey was shot execution style in the back of the head. R.C. Pettigrew was shot in the face, in the chest, and in the leg, and was also shot 4 times in the back. Roger Holloman had been shot 3 times in the back and shot once in the back of the neck. Police found the dead bodies the next day, and the men were convicted of these murders. Even though these royal family members were being sought for the November 12th triple murder, they still managed to kill Cloretta Ladd on December 2, 1980, in a South Side shootout with a gang only said to be the Disciples in the 1981 Chicago Tribune article. The shootout was with the black gangster Disciples because only them and the El Rookins ran those buildings at the time. The rampage of the royal family continued in 1980, and the leadership was being sought as authorities were especially after Roger Collins, Maurice Powell, and Murray Hooper, but the 3 men had fled to Phoenix, Arizona after they committed these drug-related murders. The trio had flown to Arizona because they were handed down a contract from the Chicago outfit to kill a print shop business owner named William Redmond. The contract was passed down by Robert Fat Man Cruz that had connected with the royal family when he was in jail with Roger Collins and Murray Hooper back in 1971. Now, almost a decade later, Cruz needed the royal family's assistance in removing Redmond, who was in the way of Cruz's real estate interest. Cruz had moved to Arizona to get involved in the real estate business, which is why he had interest in this property that Redmond refused to give up. Cruz now offered $10,000 to the royal family to kill Redmond. On December 31, 1980, Murray Hooper, Roger Collins, and a former Chicago policeman, Edward McCall, burst into the home of Redmond. The men then tied up Redmond, his wife, and his 70-year-old mother-in-law. They were laid on the bed and shot in the back of the head execution style. After they were killed, Murray Hooper slit Redmond's throat to show the outfit that they were brutal killers and should be hired again. The 3 men were arrested for these murders. Edward McCall was the first one to be taken down. McCall then hired his lawyer Michael Pritzker to get him out of the charges. When Pritzker failed to get McCall out of the charges completely, an unknown gunman attempted to kill Pritzker right outside his home in Chicago. Pritzker knew the gunman but refused to divulge who shot him and dropped McCall as his client. Murray Hooper ended up admitting to the killing and named his boss Roger Collins as involved in the murder. This led to the conviction of Roger Cochise Collins, and now he was headed back to prison in 1981. George Boony Black Davis was also headed to prison in 1981. On May 6, 1981, at the apartment of Linda Dates located at 1440 South Kedzie in the North Lawndale neighborhood, 3 men came to her door that she recognized. She recognized the men as members of the Black Gangster Disciples, according to court documents, or at least that is the rumor she heard. The men were George Boony Black Davis, Moto also referred to as Johnny Gat, and Smokey, also known as Curtis Taylor or Lee. The men came to the apartment to allegedly buy $100 worth of cocaine from Lex Leaks, who was known in the neighborhood to be a cocaine dealer. Apparently, an argument broke out between Johnny Gat and Leaks about the weight of the cocaine that resulted in a shootout that left Leaks dead and his roommate wounded. Shortly after the murder, police attempted to apprehend the men, but all of them tried to flee and destroy evidence, including George Davis, after the police came to his apartment at 3317 West Madison. When police came to arrest Davis, he ran into an abandoned apartment and locked himself and then fled down the stairwell with a shotgun in his hand after he dropped evidence, which was another firearm. According to court documents, Davis surrendered eventually. According to court documents, George Davis had been released from prison within 5 years and had violated his parole. While incarcerated in 1981 in the Illinois Department of Corrections, the royal family gang leader Cochise had met with Boony Black's Black Gangsters and the leadership of the Goon Squad Gangsters, and agreed to combine and form the Black Gangster Nation, which later merged with the newly developed New Breeds, becoming what we know now as New Breed Black Gangsters. As you can tell from the history of this organization, the New Breed Black Gangsters are far more different than any Chicago street gang and is looked at as more of a mob or organized syndicate than a street gang in the sense of common gang bangers. The Blue Five Black Disciples, or Bluefin Black Disciples, were formed sometime around the year 2000 as a breakaway faction of the Black Disciple Nation. The group was formed by Marvel Thompson aka Kingville. Kingville was second in command for the Black Disciples under Jerome Freeman before Freeman stepped down. In a bold move, Kingville broke away several South Side BD factions and aligned them under the People Alliance, including adapting Islamic beliefs seen in some nations under the Five. This new renegade faction is known as the Bluefin BDs. Some believe that this radical change to traditional Black disciple beliefs is what caused Jerome Freeman to step down. Some also attribute the poor relationship the BDs had with other folk gangs, such as the Gangster Disciples, that caused this new People faction of the BDs to emerge. The Bluefins then adopted People Nation bylaws and strong relations with Black P-Stones and Mickey Cobras. MCs and Bluefins even shared sets at 59th and King Drive, Jackson and Damon, and 117th and Princeton. Their main enemies include Gangster Disciples as well as Black Disciples still under the traditional folks bylaws. Many traditional Black disciples do not recognize Marvel Thompson Kingville as a leader and say that he is not welcome in Black disciple strongholds. In the 90s and early 2000s, this was a different story in the projects. With their leader in prison, top members of the Black Disciples were called to a South Side apartment building, the Castle, the gang called it, to hear from the newly anointed king. He told the assembled drug dealers that if they played by the BD law, they would prosper. Violators would be beaten or killed by the vanguard, the enforcers of the gang. Since that day in 1991, Marvel Thompson ran the Black Disciples gang as if it were a diversified corporation, hauling in drug profits as much as $300,000 per day, which the gang laundered with investments, including apartment buildings, a rap record label called MOB, and a car wash and nightclub in Atlanta. Using a pirate transmitter to barge in on the FM frequency operated by a Christian radio station, the gang even broadcast public service announcements to their dealers, warning them when police were near. According to a 185-page indictment released by U.S. Attorney Patrick Fitzgerald, the gang effectively took over a 16-story Chicago Housing Authority building, posting snipers on the roof to protect dealers, making as much as $45,000 per day selling crack cocaine and heroin inside the building. Lookouts were equipped with night vision goggles, according to the complaint. Thompson, a rap record producer, and 46 others were indicted on drug conspiracy charges after a 6-year investigation led by Chicago police and the FBI. Wearing helmets and wielding shotguns, police stormed down the corridors of the red brick Randolph Towers housing complex, where the gang was based, sometimes kicking in doors as they searched for suspects and scooped up $300,000 in cash. More than 400 law enforcement officers were involved in the arrests of 32 suspects, including one in Phoenix, Arizona. 2 others turned themselves in, and 13 of those indicted, including 2 top deputies to Thompson, remained at large, police said. Law enforcement officials say the operation topples the hierarchy of one of Chicago's best organized street gangs, one that terrorized neighborhoods where they plied their trade. It was a very structured organization that tried to follow its own law and act as if it was its own nation right here in Chicago, Fitzgerald said. The sales volume was frightening. On one occasion, one of the outstanding members had $3 million in profits counted in a single night. Prosecutors likened the investigation to the federal prosecution of the Gangster Disciples, whose drug-dealing operations on the South Side reached an unparalleled level of organization, extending into political activity, before the leadership was convicted in the 1990s. Thompson is registered with the state as president of MOB Records Inc., which is based on the South Side and produces several rap music acts, including an Inglewood artist, DJ Casper. Casper's Cha-Cha Slide became an international hit after its release in 2000. Thompson also has a steady history of criminal cases in Cook County. He had a pending felony case for unlawful use of a firearm, stemming from a 2002 arrest when police approached him in Inglewood and said he dropped a handgun and ran. He also was convicted of murder in 1993, but acquitted 2 months later after a witness in the case recanted, saying that only Thompson's co-defendant Alonzo Brooks was involved in the 1990 shooting. Brooks is serving a 45-year sentence. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit, Thompson appeared in federal court with 33 other defendants in the case, then spoke clearly and directly when asked by the judge if he understood the charges. While the gang allegedly sold drugs from numerous locations across the South Side, the headquarters and most lucrative operations were at the Randolph Towers, 6217 South Calumet Avenue. According to the indictment, members of the gang exercised such tight control over the building that they searched anyone who entered, including residents. Gang members once searched an undercover police officer who was wearing a bulletproof vest. When gang members felt the vest, one pulled out a gun and shot the officer in the back as he turned and ran. The officer survived the shooting, prosecutors said. Fitzgerald said the gang placed huge demands on membership for loyalty. Still, the case was built in part on the testimony of 26 informants, most of them black disciples insiders. In one case, one of the witnesses and his 6-year-old son were shot after gang members suspected that the man had testified before a grand jury. Several of the informants was in the Federal Witness Protection Program, according to a spokesman for Fitzgerald. Although numerous members of the gang were arrested and charged with serious crimes over the last several years, prosecutors said, the organization continued to operate with a shocking level of audacity, including stealing the 104.7 FM frequency from a Christian radio station. In his own mind, Marvel Thompson was the self-styled Robin Hood of Inglewood, feeding the poor and encouraging kids on the South Side to stay in school. To federal authorities, though, he was the king of a violent gang involved in selling drugs and mortgage fraud. The FBI arrested Thompson in 2004. When he pleaded guilty the next year, he admitted only that he'd sold drugs. As far as the king and all that, I've told them 1,000 times that's not me. Still, Thompson got 45 years in prison. Now he's trying to get out, 22 years early. And he has written a letter to the judge who will decide whether to free him, saying he's sorry for his illegal misdeeds and for using drug profits to try to do some good. In my mind at the time, my criminal undertakings, and fruits thereof, were legitimately used to pay rent for poorer families, pay for clothes for poorer children, and buy them school supplies and otherwise aid financially those in need in the community, Thompson wrote. You cannot simultaneously build up and destroy that which you purport to love. I embarked on a path of illegal misdeeds that would eventually completely destroy not only my life, but the lives of every person I ever loved or cared about, including those in my community I most identified with based upon our common experience of living poor. Thompson never admits in the letter that he was the leader of the Black Disciples, or, should I say, the Bluefin Black Disciples. The 9-page, handwritten letter to U.S. District Judge Elaine Bucklow is part of a recent court filing seeking Thompson's release under the 2018 First Step Act, which allows prisoners to seek sentence reductions based on changes in federal drug laws that came after they went to prison. Prosecutors oppose his bid to have his sentence, writing, Thompson led one of the largest and most violent gangs in the city. Gang activity and the gang lifestyle he championed continues to plague the communities he victimized. 3 of his co-defendants have been freed. And another top Black Disciples leader, Donnell Jahan, 52, got his 25-year sentence reduced to 20 years and is set to be released in 2025. Prosecutors routinely object to early release requests made under the First Step Act, which was passed with broad support that included Republicans, Democrats, Kanye West, and the ACLU. Despite that, federal judges in Chicago have approved more than 60% of the requests they have ruled on under that law, the Chicago Sun-Times reported. Thompson, being held at a federal prison in downstate Pecan, is among the most notorious of hundreds of Chicago criminals looking for a break under the First Step Act. In the 1990s, he became king of the Black Disciples, one of Chicago's biggest gangs. Now the gang is splintered into factions, but back then, Thompson was the unquestioned boss. The case against Thompson showed he ordered a member of his gang to be shot in the hand for disobeying an order, and his underlings were accused of beating and killing gang members who didn't follow the rules. In his letter, Thompson said he was raised by a single teenage mother. He wrote that their belongings got tossed out when they were evicted for not paying rent and that older criminals became his father figures. They believe, just as I once, that positive change can come from illegal means, he wrote. I have come to know that that is an illusion. In prison, Thompson said, he's learned carpentry, plumbing, and electrical skills and hopes to return to his family and work in community outreach. I realized that I needed to contribute to the efforts to curb the violence that the people of my community were inflicting upon each other, he wrote. And Thompson said that, if he goes free, he won't return to the gang, not that he could. After cooperating with prosecutors, my cooperation with the United States government has been made public, which fully and finally severed my criminal ties. A federal judge in Chicago cut the former king of the Black Disciples' 45-year drug conspiracy sentence by a third Tuesday but wouldn't free Marvel Thompson. U.S. District Judge Elaine Bucklow reduced the sentence of the ex-leader to 30 years after he filed an appeal under the Federal First Step Act and apologized for his crimes. Bucklow, who had sentenced Thompson in 2007, said in her ruling Tuesday that he appears to have led a productive life in prison and said that figured into her decision. But Bucklow wrote that she still needed to promote respect for the law, impose just punishment, and provide adequate deterrence. She said these interests would not be served by slashing his sentence further and releasing him as he wanted. In a letter to Bucklow, Thompson, 52, had said he was sorry for his illegal misdeeds and the Robin Hood persona he took on in Inglewood, where he told the judge he'd paid rent for poor parents and bought clothes and school supplies for their children. He acknowledged, you cannot simultaneously build up and destroy that which you purport to love. Throughout the years, the blue-finned Black Disciples faded away, although some original members from the early 2000s still represent the People Alliance as well as Islamic beliefs. These members were the originals from the 63rd and Calumet buildings. The BDs are original folks gang who always been folk, despite the temporary splinter attempted by Marvel Thompson. This splinter was at its peak only for a few years before 99.9% of all BDs continued to represent the six-pointed Star of David. Although a bold attempt to change the originality of the BD Nation was done by a leader who ended up as a government informant begging to be released from federal prison, the BD Nation still is and always been one of the kings of the folk nation.